The 25th of October 1944, 0648 hours, off the coast of Samar, Philippine Islands. The sea was glassy that morning, the kind of deceptive calm that made the horizon blur into sky. The USS Johnston, a Fletcher-class destroyer displacing just over 2,000 tons, cut through the Pacific waters at flank speed, her turbines screaming beneath steel decks, salt spray misted over her forward guns. In the pre-dawn darkness, the crew could taste the metal in the airgun oil, sweat, and fear, mixed with the iodine scent of open ocean. Commander Ernest E. Evans stood on the bridge, one hand gripping the rail, his knuckles white. Ahead of him, emerging from the mist like iron mountains, sailed the largest battleship ever built by human hands, the Yamato. Beside her, 3 more battleships, 7 heavy cruisers. Their combined weight of broadside firepower could obliterate entire coastal cities. The Johnston weighed as much as one of their gun turrets. Evans didn't turn his ship away. The American sailors knew what their ships were called: tin cans, expendable escorts, cheap hulls wrapped around engines and torpedoes, built fast and built many, designed to screen the heavy iron, the battleships, and carriers that mattered. In the doctrines written before the war, destroyers were sacrificial pawns. They laid smoke, they rescued downed pilots. They died so aircraft carriers could live. No one expected them to fight battleships. No one thought they could win. But in the waters off Samar that October morning, the tin cans would do something that shattered every assumption the Imperial Japanese Navy held about American naval power, American industry, and American will. To understand what happened in those desperate hours, you must first understand what the destroyer represented in the calculus of 20th century naval warfare. Before the Second World War, battleships were the measure of a navy's strength. Treaties limited their construction. Admirals built careers on their command. Nations measured themselves by the length of their gun barrels and the thickness of their armor belts. The battleship was prestige made steel. The destroyer was its opposite, a vessel of necessity, not glory. The Fletcher-class destroyers, of which Johnston was one, emerged from American shipyards in staggering numbers after Pearl Harbor. 175 of them would be commissioned during the war, rolling off slipways in Bath, Maine, and San Francisco, California, in a display of industrial capacity that boggled even American planners. They were 376 feet long, 39 feet wide, drew 17 feet of water, 5 5-inch guns, 10 torpedo tubes, 40mm and 20mm anti-aircraft batteries studding their superstructures like iron thorns. Crew complement: 329 officers and men. They were fast, 38 knots at flank speed, faster than any battleship ever built. They could turn inside their own length, pivot like dancers, sprint and stop and sprint again. What they lacked in armor, their hulls were barely half an inch of steel in places they made up for in agility. The philosophy was simple: don't get hit. Be somewhere else when the shells arrive. To the Imperial Japanese Navy, which had spent decades perfecting the art of the decisive battleship engagement, American destroyers were beneath contempt. Japanese heavy cruisers displaced 3 times as much. Their 8-inch guns could punch through destroyer hulls at 20 miles. Japanese doctrine emphasized spiritual strength, Bushido discipline, the warrior's acceptance of death. Japanese ships were named for mountains, for dragons, for ancient provinces. They carried the emperor's honor into battle. American destroyers were named after dead sailors. The Johnston bore the name of Lieutenant John V. Johnston, a Civil War-era officer. She was hull number DD 557, one in a series, a product line. When her keel was laid at Seattle-Tacoma Shipbuilding in May 1942, she was one of dozens under construction simultaneously. Welders worked 3 shifts. Rivets went in hot. She slid down the ways 13 months later, and by October 1943, she was prowling the Pacific, hunting submarines and escorting the carriers that were systematically dismantling Japan's empire. Her crew came from everywhere: farm boys from Iowa, dock workers from Brooklyn, men who'd never seen the ocean before Pearl Harbor. The Navy trained them fast gunnery school, damage control, engineering. 6 weeks and you were a sailor. 12 weeks and you were a specialist. The American military didn't have time for the multi-year training regimens of pre-war navies. It compensated with systems, redundancy. Doctrine that assumed men would panic and built procedures that worked anyway. Fire control computers that could calculate firing solutions faster than Japanese rangefinders. Radar that saw through darkness and smoke. And there was something else, something harder to quantify in after-action reports. The men who crewed these tin cans knew they were expendable, but they also knew that 50 miles behind them, the United States was building another destroyer every week, that the shipyard that built Johnston was simultaneously constructing 5 more just like her, that if she went down, her replacement was already on the ways. American industry was a kind of armor not for the individual ship, but for the fleet, for the nation, for the idea that free men with factories could outproduce empires. The Japanese had no equivalent. When they lost a heavy cruiser, it took 2 years to replace. Their shipyards were already running at capacity. They had fewer trained crews, fewer spare parts, less fuel oil. Japanese destroyers were individually magnificent, some were faster, some carried more torpedoes, but there would never be enough of them. Japanese naval strategy rested on qualitative superiority, on the assumption that their warriors were worth 10 Americans each. Off Samar, that assumption would be tested to destruction. The Battle of Leyte Gulf was the largest naval engagement in human history, a sprawling melee across hundreds of miles of ocean involving more than 300 ships. The Japanese plan was audacious. Lure the American carriers north with a decoy fleet, then send the heavy surface units, the battleships and cruisers, through the Philippine archipelago to smash the invasion fleet, landing troops at Leyte. It nearly worked. Admiral Halsey took the bait, steaming north with the fast carriers. That left a small force of escort carriers themselves called jeep carriers, slow and lightly armed, guarded by a screen of destroyers and destroyer escorts off Samar's coast. At dawn on October 25, the Japanese center forced 4 battleships, 6 heavy cruisers, 2 light cruisers, 11 destroyers emerged from San Bernardino Strait and caught the Americans completely by surprise. The escort carriers, with their wooden flight decks and 18-knot top speed, were helpless. They began launching every plane they had and running south, making smoke, calling desperately for help that was hours away. Between the Japanese battle wagons and the carriers stood 7 destroyers and destroyer escorts. Taffy 3, they were called. Task Unit 77.4.3. Commanded by Rear Admiral Clifton Sprague from the carrier Fanshawe Bay, the unit had been conducting anti-submarine patrols. They weren't supposed to fight battleships. They weren't armed for it. They weren't trained for it. Commander Evans didn't wait for orders. At 0716, with Japanese shells already straddling the carriers, Johnston heeled hard to port and charged. Alone, full speed, directly at the Japanese center force. Evans came over the intercom. A large Japanese fleet has been contacted. They are 15 miles away and headed in our direction. They are believed to have 4 battleships, 8 cruisers, and a number of destroyers. This will be a fight against overwhelming odds from which survival cannot be expected. We will do what damage we can. The crew didn't flinch. They'd trained for this, in a way. Every gun drill, every torpedo exercise, every damage control scenario had prepared them for the moment when the tin can would have to die so something more important could live. But something else drove them forward too. Something Evans understood in his bones. He was Cherokee, one of the few Native American officers in the Navy, and he'd grown up in Oklahoma knowing what it meant to be underestimated. His ship was a tin can, his crew were kids, and he was going to show the Imperial Japanese Navy what that was worth. Johnston raced across the distance at 35 knots, her 5-inch guns barking every few seconds. The Japanese heavy cruiser Kumano swung her massive 8-inch turrets to bear. Shells taller than a man began to fall. The first salvos missed, the range was closing too fast. The destroyer was too small and too fast. Johnston fired her torpedoes at 10,000 yards, all 10 tubes, then heeled hard to starboard and disappeared into her own smoke. One torpedo struck Kumano in the bow, The explosion tore away 60 feet of her forward hull, wrecked her steering, flooded her forward compartments. She fell out of formation, listing, finished as a combat unit. A $30,000 torpedo fired from a $2 million destroyer had crippled a ship worth 50 times as much and carrying 1,000 men. But the Japanese weren't done. Johnston emerged from the smoke and immediately took fire from multiple cruisers. Shells walked up her stern. A 14-inch round from the battleship Congo struck her aft deckhouse, penetrated the thin armor, and detonated inside. The blast killed dozens instantly, wrecked her aft steering, knocked out power to half her systems. Shrapnel scythed through the bridge. Evans lost 2 fingers. The deck ran with blood. Johnston didn't stop. Her engineers bypassed ruined systems. Her damage control teams shored bulkheads. Her gunners kept firing. She maneuvered on manual steering, her rudder controlled by men deep in her belly, cranking wheels by hand, shouting ranges through sound-powered phones because the electrical systems were dead. She was a dying ship that refused to die. And she wasn't alone anymore. The other destroyers, Howell, Heerman, Samuel B. Roberts, charged. The destroyer escorts followed. Ships that displaced 1,400 tons attacked battleships, displacing 70,000. They closed to point-blank range and fired torpedoes. They threw up walls of smoke. They maneuvered with such reckless aggression that Japanese captains, accustomed to cautious American tactics, hesitated. Were these destroyers the vanguard of a larger force? Were American battleships lurking in the smoke? Japanese admirals had spent careers studying Jutland and Tsushima, battles where fleets maneuvered in stately formation. This was chaos. This was knife fighting. This was not how naval warfare was supposed to work. For 2.5 hours, the tin cans held. They bought time measured in minutes and paid in lives. Howell went down at 0855, her hull shattered by 40 hits. Samuel B. Roberts followed at 0910, her keel broken by a magazine explosion. Johnston lasted until 0945. By then, she'd been hit so many times her hull was more whole than steel. Her main guns were silent, ammunition exhausted. Her engines were flooded. She wallowed dead in the water as Japanese destroyers closed for the kill. A Japanese officer on the destroyer Yukikaze saluted as she went under. He recognized courage when he saw it, even in an enemy. Especially in an enemy. 186 of Johnston's crew went down with her. Commander Evans was last seen on the bridge as the water rose. He would receive the Medal of Honor posthumously, the first Native American naval officer so honored. But here is what matters. The carriers escaped. Every single one of Taffy 3's escort carriers survived. They limped away, damaged, bloodied, but afloat. The invasion fleet at Leyte was untouched, and the Japanese center force, despite overwhelming superiority, broke off the attack and retreated. Admiral Kurita, commanding from the heavy cruiser Yamato, believed he'd engaged fleet carriers and heavy cruisers. His ships were damaged, his formation scattered. He'd lost track of the tactical situation. The aggressive defense by destroyers' ships he'd expected to brush aside had convinced him he was walking into a trap. He turned north and sailed away from the greatest victory the Imperial Japanese Navy would ever have the chance to win. After the war, when historians sifted through Japanese records, they found something remarkable in the after-action reports. Japanese officers had grossly overestimated the size and power of the American ships they'd engaged. They reported engaging fleet carriers when they'd been shooting at escort carriers. They reported heavy cruisers where only destroyers had been. Some of this was the fog of war, smoke and confusion obscure everything. But some of it was something else. Some of it was the inability to process what they were seeing. Japanese naval doctrine was built on scarcity. Every ship was precious. Every engagement was calculated. Risk was managed. Ships were preserved for the decisive battle, the climactic engagement where the fate of empires would be decided in a single afternoon, as it had been at Tsushima in 1905 when Admiral Togo destroyed the Russian fleet. Japanese destroyers screened. They scouted. They launched torpedoes from range. They did not charge battleships alone. That American destroyers did exactly that, violated the fundamental logic of how naval warfare worked. It suggested that the Americans didn't value their ships, that they were willing to throw away hulls and crews with abandon, which was true, in a sense, but not the way the Japanese understood it. The Americans could afford to lose destroyers because they had 50 more under construction. They could afford aggressive tactics because aggressive tactics shortened wars, and short wars were cheaper than long ones. The calculus was industrial, not spiritual. It was a kind of mathematics that the Japanese, for all their technical brilliance, had never quite internalized. And there was something else in those reports, something that appeared again and again in Japanese accounts of fighting American ships: surprise at the volume of fire, astonishment at the speed of damage control, confusion at how American ships kept fighting after hits that should have destroyed them. Japanese damage control doctrine assumed that men would fight their stations until death. American doctrine assumed men would panic and route damage control teams through separate, redundant pathways so that if one team was wiped out, another could take over. Japanese ships had excellent pumps. American ships had more pumps and backups and manuals that petty officers with 8th grade educations could follow in the dark. The Johnston absorbed hits that would have sunk many Japanese destroyers outright. She kept fighting because her designers had assumed she'd be hit and had built in redundancy at every level. Dual steering systems, multiple fire control stations, distributed ammunition supplies. The doctrine was called fight hurt, and it emerged from the American cultural assumption that things would go wrong, plans would fail, and you'd have to improvise. It was engineering as philosophy. Build for failure, because failure is inevitable. To Japanese eyes, this looked like magic, or madness. Ships that should have sunk kept fighting, destroyers that should have run away attacked. The Americans fought like they had nothing to lose, which was true, because behind every destroyer was another destroyer, and behind that was a shipyard that could build a replacement in 4 months. Japanese destroyers took a year to build. Japanese heavy cruisers took 2. The Yamato took 4 years and consumed resources equivalent to several infantry divisions. When Kumano limped away from Samar with her bow blown off, she represented an investment Japan couldn't replace. She survived that day but was sunk by aircraft a week later. The torpedo that crippled her had been built in a factory in Virginia by women who'd never seen the ocean. It cost less than a mid-range automobile. This was the arithmetic that Japan couldn't solve: quality versus quantity, craftsmanship versus mass production, the warrior ethos versus the factory line. Admiral Yamamoto, who'd studied at Harvard and served in Washington, had tried to explain it before the war. He'd told the Japanese cabinet that attacking America was waking a sleeping giant. He knew what American industry could do. He'd driven across the country and seen the oil fields of Texas, the steel mills of Pennsylvania, the endless farms of the Midwest. He understood that America's strength wasn't in individual heroism, but in aggregate capacity. Most Japanese officers never saw America. They saw American ships' individual hulls that could be sunk. They never internalized that those hulls were products, items in a catalogue, things that could be ordered and delivered like any other commodity. The Johnston wasn't unique. She was hull number 557 inches a series. Her wreck lies somewhere off Samar in 21,000 feet of water. Her replacement, USS Johnston DD, 821, a different Fletcher-class destroyer, was commissioned in June 1945. Same name, same mission. The symbolic continuity was the point. There's a photograph of the Johnston taken in 1943, shortly after her commissioning. She's tied up at a pier in Seattle, fresh paint gleaming, her crew assembled on deck in dress whites. They look impossibly young. Most are barely out of high school. Some are grinning. Some look serious, trying to appear older than they are. In the background, you can see more destroyers in various stages of construction, hulls on the ways, cranes swinging steel, smoke from welding torches. The photograph is a snapshot of American industrial power at its peak. Every man in that photo knew he was part of something larger. The destroyer beneath his feet was one of dozens. The pier where she was moored was one of many. The shipyard was one of scores scattered across the coasts. The steel in her hull came from Pittsburgh, The turbines came from General Electric. The guns were cast in Maryland. The radar was developed at MIT. She was a collective effort, the product of a supply chain that stretched across a continent and employed millions. Japanese ships were built differently, more hand-fitting, more craftsmanship, tighter tolerances. Japanese naval architects were brilliant. Some of their designs were more efficient than American equivalents. But efficiency wasn't the point. Volume was the point. The United States built destroyers the way it built everything else. Standardized designs, interchangeable parts, construction broken into tasks simple enough that newly trained workers could perform them. The welder who joined Johnston's hull plates didn't need to understand naval architecture. He just needed to follow the blueprint and make the weld clean. This was offensive to traditional notions of craftsmanship. It reduced skilled labor to repetitive tasks. It turned shipbuilding into an assembly line. But it worked. American shipyards produced destroyers faster than the Japanese could sink them. Escort carriers faster than submarines could find them. Liberty ships, the slow, ugly cargo vessels that kept the supply lines open, were being built in an average of 42 days by 1943. One yard launched 3 in a single day. The men aboard Johnston knew this. They knew they were replaceable in the cold calculus of war. But they also knew they were backed by the full weight of American industry, and that gave them a strange kind of confidence. If they died, the mission would continue. Another ship would take their place. The war would go on. This wasn't fatalism. It was the opposite. It was faith in the system, in the collective enterprise, in the idea that individual sacrifice mattered because it was part of something that couldn't be stopped. Japanese sailors had faith in the emperor and in their own martial spirit. American sailors had faith in logistics. It sounds prosaic, unromantic, and yet off Sama it was the American faith that proved stronger. When Johnston charged alone at the Japanese fleet, her crew wasn't acting out of suicidal devotion to a divine sovereign. They were buying time. They were following doctrine. They were doing the math, 329 lives balanced against 30,000 troops on the invasion beaches. The transaction made sense if you thought about it as a system. One destroyer for a beachhead. One tin can to save a fleet. Commander Evans understood this in a way that's hard to articulate. His final order to his crew wasn't a samurai's death poem. It was a statement of fact. Survival cannot be expected. We will do what damage we can. It was the language of engineering, not mysticism. Do damage. Degrade enemy capability. Attrit their forces. The destroyer was a tool, and tools are used up. The crew knew it. They did it anyway. There's a moment in the battle that stayed with survivors for the rest of their lives. It came about halfway through, when Johnston was already badly damaged but still fighting. A Japanese heavy cruiser, probably Haguro, closed to point-blank range, perhaps 6,000 yards, and opened fire with her 8-inch main batteries. At that range, the shells arrived almost instantaneously. There was no time to maneuver, no time to think. Johnston's forward gun crews kept firing. 5-inch guns against 8-inch armor. It was absurd. The shells couldn't penetrate the cruiser's belt, but they could wreck superstructure, damage fire control, kill exposed personnel. So the crews kept loading, kept firing, kept dying as Japanese shells tore through their positions. And here's what the survivors remembered. Between salvos, in the seconds when they were loading the next shell, they could hear music. Someone on the ship had left a radio on, and it was playing big band. Glenn Miller, maybe, or Tommy Dorsey. Swing music, dance hall music, the kind of thing you'd hear at a USO show or a high school dance. It was surreal explosions and fire and screaming men, and underneath it all, the bouncy, optimistic sound of American popular music. One of the gun captains, a kid from Chicago named Robert Billy, later said it was the most American thing he'd ever experienced. The juxtaposition of horror and normalcy, death and dance music, the fact that even in the middle of a desperate battle, some part of American culture was still playing, still broadcasting, still present. He said it made him feel like the whole country was there with him, not just the Navy, not just the fleet, but everyone. The band leaders and the factory workers and the people listening to that same music back home. It's a small detail. It doesn't appear in the official action reports, but it captures something essential about what American forces brought to the Pacific. They brought industrial capacity, and they brought radar, and they brought mass production. But they also brought a culture that assumed life should be enjoyable, that ordinary pleasures mattered, that even a warship should have a radio for the crew to listen to in off hours. Japanese ships didn't have radios playing American music. They had Shinto shrines. They had discipline. They had the warrior code. They had everything except the underlying assumption that individual happiness was worth preserving. American democracy was inefficient and chaotic, and full of people who complained and argued and demanded explanations. But it produced sailors who fought with the radio on, who knew exactly why they were fighting, who'd volunteered because they'd seen newsreels and read papers and decided for themselves that this was necessary. You can't quantify that in a gunnery table. You can't put it in a damage report. By 0945, Johnston was finished. Her engines were flooded. Her guns were silent. Fires burned throughout her hull. The wounded crowded the main deck, waiting for the order to abandon ship. Japanese destroyers circled, firing into the wreck. Commander Evans, bleeding from multiple wounds, refused to leave the bridge. He was seen for the last time standing beside the binnacle, watching his crew go over the side. The ship rolled to port and went down stern first. Men in the water reported that her forward gun mount, the one that had fired continuously for 2.5 hours, kept training back and forth as she sank. The crew inside still at their stations, even as the water closed over them. It was probably just hydraulics failing randomly, but survivors swore it looked like she was still trying to aim, still trying to fight. 186 men died with her. 143 were rescued, some after days in the water, fighting off sharks and drinking rainwater and hallucinating from sun exposure. The Navy gave Commander Evans the Medal of Honor. The ship received a Presidential Unit Citation. The battle became a legend. Books were written. Documentaries were filmed. Historians called it the greatest last stand in naval history. But for decades, no one knew exactly where Johnston lay. The Pacific is deep off Samar, 21,000 feet in places. Deeper than Everest is tall. She'd vanished into darkness so complete that no light from the surface could ever reach her. The crew who went down with her were entombed in a hull that would never corrode away, never return to the surface, never be recovered. They were gone as completely as men can be gone. In 2019, a civilian expedition found her. Victor Vescovo, a private explorer with a deep submersible, located the wreck using sonar and then dived to it. The footage he brought back showed a broken ship on an alien landscape. Her hull was split. Her guns were pointed at odd angles. Coral and deep-sea life had colonized her superstructure, but she was recognizable. Still a destroyer, still a warship, still Johnston. The discovery was announced quietly. The Navy issued a statement. Survivors were contacted, and around the world, people who'd never heard of the Battle of Samar learned the story of the tin can that charged battleships. In the comments sections and on social media, and in the long essays that naval historians wrote for military journals, the same themes kept appearing. Courage, sacrifice, the little guy standing up to the bully, David and Goliath. All of which is true, as far as it goes. But it misses something important. Johnston didn't win because of courage alone. She won because she represented a system, industrial, doctrinal, cultural, that could produce ships faster than the enemy could sink them. Her crew weren't heroes in the classical sense. They were products of a democracy that had decided, collectively, that fascism was intolerable and had mobilized every resource to oppose it. They were kids from farms and cities who'd been trained quickly and equipped adequately and sent into battle with the understanding that, if they died, the war would go on. The mission would continue. Someone else would finish the job. That's not romantic. It's not the stuff of ancient epics. But it's the truth. The Japanese heavy cruiser Kumano, crippled off Samar, survived for 6 more days before American aircraft caught her near Luzon and sent her to the bottom. She'd been a beautiful ship, built with craftsmanship and care, named for a sacred mountain, manned by sailors who believed in the righteousness of their cause. She'd been built to last and to win, and to carry the Emperor's banner across the Pacific. And she'd been wrecked by a torpedo from a ship that cost a fraction of her value, fired by men who'd been civilians 18 months earlier, produced by a system that could afford to lose a dozen destroyers and keep fighting. That was the lesson of Samar. Not that American sailors were braver or better, but that American industry was deeper and broader and more resilient than anything the Axis could match. For every Johnston that went down, 3 more were being built. For every sailor killed, 2 more were in training. For every shell expended, 100 more were in production. The arithmetic was brutal and impersonal, but it was definitive. The Japanese called them tin cans, and they were right. Cheap, expendable, mass-produced. But there were so many of them, and they fought with such ferocity that in the end, it didn't matter. The tin cans won. Years later, a reporter asked one of Johnston's survivors what he wanted people to remember about the battle. The man, his name was Jack Callahan. He'd been a fireman in the engine room, thought for a long time. Finally, he said, "We weren't special. That's what I want people to know. We weren't heroes. We were just sailors doing our job. And the job got done because there were so many of us. Because they kept building ships and training crews and sending us out. We were part of something big. That's what beat them. Not us. All of us. It's not the answer you expect. It's not the narrative of individual heroism that we prefer, but it's the truth that Johnston represents. She was one ship in a fleet of thousands, one crew among millions, one battle in a war that stretched across oceans and continents and consumed entire nations. She mattered because she was part of a collective effort so vast that no single defeat could stop it. The Japanese understood this too late. After the war, when Admiral Kurita was interviewed about why he'd broken off the attack at Samar, he couldn't quite articulate it. He talked about the confusion, the losses, the aggressive defense, but underneath, you can sense something else, a realization that he was fighting not just ships, but a system, that every destroyer he sank would be replaced, that the Americans would keep coming. That victory required not just winning a battle, but exhausting an enemy that couldn't be exhausted, because it could always build more. The wreck of Johnston lies in the darkness now, 4 miles down, a tomb for men who died doing the math, 329 lives for an invasion fleet, 1 destroyer for a beachhead. The transaction was accepted. The price was paid. And the war went on. She was a tin can, but she was enough. In the end, she was enough.